In 1772, a traveler could ride the length of the American colonies and never once eat in a restaurant. They did not exist. Not one. Instead, there were taverns, and in Williamsburg there was one for every 100 people. You did not order, you ate whatever the fire held that day at a price fixed by law, elbow to elbow with strangers. Number 14 was so common that cooks plucked a bird, roasted it, then stitched it back together to fool the table. And number 2 was finished with a red-hot iron pulled from the coals. These 25 meals fed a nation into being, then vanished. Hit subscribe and let us count down. Number 25, rye and Injun bread. Before a tavern could serve you meat, it served you bread, and in New England, that bread was almost never white. Wheat would barely grow in the rocky northern soil, so the tavern cook reached for what she had: cornmeal, rye flour, a little wheat if she was lucky, molasses, and water. There was no oven in most ordinaries, only a hearth. So she packed the dark, wet dough into a covered tin or a crock, set it in a pot of simmering water, and let it steam for hours until it turned into a dense, sweet, almost black loaf. They called it rye and Injun, or thirds bread, or simply brown bread. It sliced heavy and moist and stood up to anything you put beside it. A traveler coming in off a frozen road would tear into a slab of it slathered with what little butter there was, and it would sit in his stomach like ballast. This was the bread that soaked up the bean pot every Saturday night for 200 years. Number 24, peas porridge. There is a nursery rhyme that most Americans can still half remember. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That was not a children's song. That was a tavern menu. Dried split peas were the cheapest, most reliable food in the colonial North, and a good ordinary kept a pot of them going almost constantly, simmered down with a scrap of salt pork, an onion, and whatever the cook had. It thickened into a green-gray sludge that looked like nothing at all and tasted like survival, earthy and salty and warm, and the rhyme was literal. The pot was rarely emptied and rarely washed. Fresh peas and water went in on top of yesterday's, and the whole thing deepened in flavor as the week wore on. A weary traveler in January did not ask questions. He ate the porridge, drank his cider, and was grateful the pot was hot and not 9 days cold. Number 23, switchel. Long before anyone bottled a sports drink, tavern keepers and farmhands were mixing switchel, and it did the same job 2 centuries earlier. The recipe was almost nothing: cold water, a good pour of molasses or brown sugar, a splash of cider vinegar, and a knob of grated fresh ginger. That was it. Farmers called it haymaker's punch because you drank it in the fields under a punishing sun, and the vinegar and sugar and ginger together did something to a body that plain water could not. It cut the thirst, settled the stomach, and put a little fire back in a man who had been swinging a scythe since dawn. Taverns kept it on hand in the warm months, sometimes spiked with rum, sometimes served plain. We spend $4 on electrolyte water now. They spent a penny on vinegar and molasses and knew exactly what they were doing. Number 22, Johnny cakes. Take cornmeal, add hot water and a pinch of salt, and drop the batter onto a screaming hot griddle greased with pork fat. That is a Johnny cake, and it may be the most American food ever cooked. The indigenous peoples of New England had been making cornmeal cakes on hot stones for centuries before a single colonist arrived, and the settlers, staring at soil that would not grow their beloved wheat, adopted the recipe the moment they tasted it. In a tavern, Johnny cakes came off the fire fast and hot, denser than a pancake, chewy in the middle, lacy and crisp at the edges where the fat caught them. A traveler ate them stacked with butter and molasses, or torn apart to sop up gravy. The name is likely a worn-down version of journey cake because they were the perfect thing to carry in a saddlebag. And when there was nothing else in the tavern larder, there was always cornmeal, and there was always the griddle. Number 21, potted meat. This was how a tavern made a single ham last for weeks, and how it turned the toughest, cheapest scraps into something a gentleman would spread on his bread. The cook took a chunk of meat, beef, ham, tongue, sometimes rabbit, or a brace of small birds, and boiled or baked it until it fell apart. Then she pounded it in a mortar, sometimes for an hour, until it became a smooth paste. She worked in butter, salt, mace, nutmeg, and pepper, pressed the whole thing into a small crock, and sealed the top with a thick layer of melted, clarified butter. That fat seal locked the air out completely, and the potted meat kept for weeks without ice, on a shelf in the summer heat. When a hungry traveler came in between meals, the cook cut the seal, spread the rich spiced paste on fresh bread, and had a meal in front of him in 1 minute. This was the Colonial deli counter, and it ran on nothing but butter and patience. Number 20, Salmagundi. Here is where a fine city tavern showed off. Salmagundi was the Colonial composed salad, and it was less a recipe than a work of architecture. On a wide platter, the cook arranged concentric rings of chopped ingredients, each in its own band of color: shredded cold chicken or turkey, minced hard-boiled eggs, chopped anchovies, pickled onions, capers, slivered apples, watercress, and whatever bright bits the garden offered. In the center went a small mound, sometimes a whole pickled herring standing on its tail, and the whole thing was dressed with oil, vinegar, and mustard. It looked like a stained glass window laid flat on the table. And it was genius because it used up a dozen small leftovers that would otherwise have gone to waste and turned them into the most impressive dish in the room. A traveler shown a good Salmagundi knew he had walked into a tavern that cared. Number 19, succotash. The word comes from the Narragansett language, and the dish is older than the country by centuries. At its simplest, succotash was corn and beans cooked together in one pot, and the two plants completed each other so perfectly that the indigenous farmers who invented it had understood something about nutrition that Europe would not figure out for generations. In a colonial tavern, succotash got a little richer. The cook simmered dried corn and shell beans low and slow with a hunk of salt pork, so the whole pot turned smoky, and the fat gave the vegetables a depth they had no right to. It filled a stomach and cost almost nothing, because the corn and beans came dried by the sackful and kept all winter. It was the meal that sat on the table when the meat ran short, which on the frontier was most of the time. First pattern break. Here is where you need to understand what a tavern actually was, because it was not a restaurant and it was not a bar. It was the whole town crammed into one room. The tavern was the post office, where the newspaper was read aloud to men who could not read. It was the courthouse, where a traveling judge held trials between tankards. It was the stock exchange, the auction house, and the stagecoach depot. It was where you voted, where you enlisted, where you heard that war had broken out. Philadelphia had more than 120 taverns in 1776. You did not choose a dish. You sat at a long communal table at a set hour, the food came out on pewter, the price was fixed by colonial law, so no keeper could gouge a stranger, and you ate what everyone else ate. You came for the news, the fire, and the company. Number 18. Beef collops. When a tavern had beef and no time, the cook made collops. She cut the meat into thin slices, pounded them thinner still with the flat of a cleaver, and threw them into a screaming hot pan slicked with butter or dripping. 2 minutes aside, no more, and they were done, seared brown at the edges and still tender within. Then she deglazed the pan with a splash of claret or cider, scraped up every caramelized scrap, threw in an anchovy or a spoon of pickled walnut liquor for a savory punch, and poured that dark gravy back over the meat. The whole dish came together faster than the traveler could pull off his wet boots. This was fast food in 1750, honest fast food, made from a cut too small to roast and a cook too rushed to stew. Modern cooks call it minute steak now and pretend it is a compromise. The colonial cook knew it was one of the best things she made. Number 17. A ragout of cucumbers. The spelling looks strange, but say it aloud, and you will hear the French word ragout hiding underneath. And that is exactly what it was. Colonial cooks were mad for anything that smacked of French sophistication, and a ragout, a rich made dish of vegetables or meat cooked down in a thick, buttery, spiced sauce, was the height of it. The cucumber version sounds bizarre to modern ears and tasted wonderful. The cook peeled and sliced cucumbers, floured and browned them in butter, then stewed them down with onion, a little gravy, pepper, and nutmeg until they went soft and silky and lost every trace of their raw crunch. It rescued a glut of late summer vegetables and dressed them up as something worthy of a gentleman's table. Served alongside a roast, a ragout told the room that somewhere back in that smoky kitchen, a cook was reaching for elegance. Number 16. Spruce beer and small beer. No colonial meal was complete without a drink, and that drink was almost never water, which brings us to the beer that ran through every tavern like a river. Small beer was a weak, lightly fermented brew, low enough in alcohol that men, women, and even children drank it all day long. Spruce beer took it further, flavored with the young green tips of spruce trees, boiled with molasses and fermented, which gave it a piney bite, and though nobody understood the chemistry, a dose of vitamin C that quietly kept scurvy at bay through long winters. A keeper brewed his own in great barrels in the cellar and drew it by the mug all day. When a traveler asked for a drink and did not specify, this is what landed in front of him: a foaming mug of homemade beer, faintly sweet, faintly bitter, and completely woven into the rhythm of the day. Second pattern break. So why did everyone drink like that? Because the water might kill you. Colonists carried an old and well-earned European fear of drinking water, and then they promptly polluted every stream near every settlement, which made the fear even more sensible. But fermented and distilled drinks did not make you sick. The alcohol and the boiling killed what the water carried. So cider, beer, and rum became the safe choice, and they were everywhere. Most colonists started the day with a tankard of hard cider before they had eaten a bite, and rum was so central it was practically currency. This was not a society of drunkards, exactly. It was a society that had quietly decided fermented calories were the sensible way to hydrate, and the tavern was the great engine that kept every mug filled from dawn until the fire burned down. Number 15. Cheshire pork pie. A pie in colonial America was not dessert. A pie was a way to package a meal, and the Cheshire pork pie was one of the finest ever to come out of a tavern oven. The cook layered slices of pork tenderloin with slices of tart apple, seasoned the whole thing with nutmeg, pepper, and sugar, poured in a little white wine, and sealed it all under a sturdy crust that could survive a stagecoach journey. As it baked, the pork, and the apple and the wine melted together into something between savory and sweet, the fruit almost dissolving into a sauce that soaked into the meat. When the crust was broken, the smell of spiced pork and cider apples filled the room. For a traveler, a wedge of pork pie was a complete meal in one hand, no plate required. The English brought the idea, but the colonial orchards, heavy with apples, made it America's own. Number 14. Pigeon pie. Here is the dish that sounds impossible today. In colonial America, the passenger pigeon was so numerous that flocks darkened the sky for hours, and men knocked them down with sticks. They were the cheapest meat in the country, and so the tavern pigeon pie was food for the common man, not the gentleman. The cook cleaned the little birds, browned them, and packed them whole or halved into a deep dish with hard-boiled eggs, forcemeat balls, butter, and a splash of stock, then sealed the whole thing under pastry and baked it until the crust rose golden and the birds went fork tender. And here is the trick that made a plain pigeon pie look grand. Sometimes the cook left the bird's feet poking up through the crust, so a diner knew exactly what he was getting. It tasted rich and dark, closer to fine game than to chicken. We could never make this pie now. We hunted the passenger pigeon to extinction, the last one dying in 1914. A meal that once fed the poor is now literally impossible. Number 13. Oyster stew. It is almost impossible to explain how many oysters there were. The bays and rivers of the colonies were so thick with them that they were poor people's food, sold by the barrel, shucked by the bucketful, and eaten by anyone who lived near the water. A tavern near the coast or a tidal river kept oysters constantly, and the simplest, most beloved way to serve them was stewed. The cook heated milk or cream with a lump of butter, dropped in the shucked oysters with their briny liquor, and pulled the pot off the fire the instant their edges curled, no longer, or they would toughen. A crack of pepper, maybe a crushed cracker to thicken it, and that was supper. A bowl of warm cream studded with plump, silky oysters that tasted of the sea. The idea that oysters are a luxury would have made a colonial tavern keeper laugh out loud. Number 12. Scrapple. In the Pennsylvania Dutch country, when a hog was slaughtered, nothing was wasted, and the proof was scrapple. The cook took all the scraps left after the good cuts were gone, the trimmings, the odd bits, the meat clinging to the head and bones, and simmered them for hours until everything fell apart and gave up its flavor to the pot. Then she stirred in cornmeal and buckwheat flour until the mixture thickened like porridge, seasoned it hard with sage, thyme, and black pepper, and poured it into loaf pans to set overnight into a firm gray brick. The next morning, she sliced that brick a half-inch thick and fried it until each side turned deep mahogany brown and crackling crisp, the inside still soft. Served with fried eggs and a drizzle of molasses or apple butter, it was thrift turned into breakfast, and in the tavern country of eastern Pennsylvania, it was as common as bread. Number 11. Fricasseed chicken. Chicken was one meat almost every tavern could get, because a hen went from the yard to the pot in an afternoon, and the favorite way to serve it was fricasseed. The cook jointed the bird, browned the pieces in butter, then stewed them gently in a sauce built from the pan drippings, a little flour, cream, or wine, and a shower of herbs and nutmeg until the meat was falling off the bone and swimming in a rich, pale gravy. Done well, it was one of the most comforting things a traveler could be handed after a long, cold day. Done badly, it was memorable for the wrong reasons. Sarah Kemble Knight, riding alone from Boston to New York in 1704, ordered a fricassee at an ordinary in rye and found it so badly bungled that she wrote in her diary she went to bed hungry rather than eat it. A good fricassee told you the cook knew her business. Third pattern break. Now stop and think about who was actually making all of this food, because the history books usually skip right past them. The men whose names hung on the tavern signs, the jolly hosts who greeted travelers at the door, were rarely the ones cooking. In the kitchen, sweating over an open hearth for 18 hours a day, were women and enslaved people. Colonial law often granted tavern licenses specifically to widows, because a woman left without a husband had almost no other way to survive. And in tavern after tavern, especially in the South, the cooking, the hauling, and the serving were done by enslaved men and women whose names appear in the records only as property, listed in an estate inventory right between the barrels of rum and the mahogany tables. The elegant dishes on this list were the work of hands that were never allowed to sit at the table and eat them. Remember that. Number 10, turtle soup. Not every tavern was a rough roadside ordinary. In the great port cities, the finest establishments served the rich, the powerful, and the political, and the dish that announced you had arrived somewhere expensive was turtle soup. A live sea turtle was a costly, dramatic thing to buy and butcher, and the soup made from it was a production. The meat simmered for hours into a deep, rich broth, thickened, spiced, and finished with a generous pour of Madeira or sherry. Philadelphia's City Tavern, which John Adams called the most genteel tavern in America, served a famous version. And it is entirely possible George Washington himself spooned it up there during the Continental Congress. It signaled wealth and power to everyone else in the candlelit room. A frontiersman would never have seen it. A delegate to Congress ate it while arguing about the fate of a nation. Number 9, beef a la mode. This was the Sunday showpiece. The dish a tavern brought out when it wanted to feed a crowd something grand from a cut that was anything but. The cook took a large, tough, cheap piece of beef, larded it by threading strips of fat right through the meat with a special needle, then browned it hard and set it to braise low and slow over a gentle fire for 3 or 4 hours with onions, herbs, wine, and spices. Time did the work. That long, patient simmer broke down the toughest muscle into something you could cut with a spoon, sitting in a dark, glossy gravy, thick with the flavor of the drippings, finished with mushrooms and a sharp bite of horseradish. A whole tableful of hungry travelers could be fed from one economical joint, and every one of them would swear they had eaten like a lord. This is the ancestor of every pot roast in America. Number 8, election cake. In New England, Election Day was not a quiet trip to a booth. It was a huge, crowded, all-day festival, and men traveled for hours to the town center to vote, argue, drink, and be fed. The tavern was the center of it, and the food that fueled it was election cake, a massive, dense, boozy cake built to survive a muddy carriage ride and hours of political shouting. The cook packed it with dried fruit, warming spices, and a heavy hand of brandy or whiskey, closer to a fruitcake than anything delicate. Amelia Simmons printed a recipe in 1796 that called for enough butter, sugar, raisins, and wine to feed an entire town, baked to sustain the men making the journey to the polls. There is something deeply, permanently American about the fact that one of the country's earliest voting traditions was built around a cake with liquor baked right into it. Number 7, spoon bread. In the southern colonies, the cornmeal that fed the north as coarse porridge got refined into something soft, rich, and almost elegant, and they called it spoon bread. The cook scalded cornmeal with milk, beat in eggs and butter, and baked the batter until it rose and set into something that was not quite a bread and not quite a pudding, but a soft, steaming, savory cloud you served, as the name says, with a spoon. It could not be sliced. It had to be scooped, trembling and hot, straight from the dish, and it went beside roasted meats and seafood as the finest side a tavern could offer. George Washington was said to favor the seafood and spoon-bread suppers at Christiana Campbell's Tavern in Williamsburg. It was proof of how far the humble corn kernel could be pushed, from survival mush at the bottom of the menu all the way to a dish fit for the man who would become the first president. Number 6. New England boiled dinner. The Puritans who settled New England came from a corner of England where boiling was simply how you cooked, and they brought that habit across the ocean intact. The boiled dinner was its purest expression, and it was the definition of one-pot practicality. Into a great kettle over the fire went a piece of corned or salted beef, and around it, added in the right order so nothing turned to mush, went cabbage, potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, and beets. Everything cooked together in the same salty, meaty broth until the beef was tender and the vegetables were soft and stained pink from the beets. The cook lifted it all onto one great platter, sliced the meat and set it in the middle of the table to share. It required almost no skill and almost no watching, which is exactly why a busy tavern loved it. One fire, one pot, and a whole room full of cold, tired travelers fed a proper hot supper. The broth left behind became tomorrow's soup. Number 5. Syllabub. After the meat and the pies came the moment a tavern turned charming, and nothing charmed like a syllabub. It was somewhere between a dessert and a drink, and it looked like magic in the glass. The cook whipped fresh cream with sugar, lemon, and a good pour of wine, cider, or sherry, until it foamed, then spooned it into tall glasses and let it stand. As it sat, it separated on its own into 2 layers, a thick, sweet, alcoholic cloud of foam floating on top, and a clear, boozy liquid pooled below. You ate the foam with a spoon, then drank the wine underneath. The most theatrical cooks milked the cow directly into the wine to make the froth. Samuel Fraunces, who ran the famous Fraunces Tavern in New York, where Washington bade farewell to his officers, advertised syllabubs among his specialties as early as 1766. It was frivolous, it was delightful, and it was exactly the note a tavern wanted to end an evening on. 4th pattern break. So what killed all of this? Why did the tavern meal vanish so completely that we forgot it existed? The answer is a revolution, but not the American one. When the French Revolution tore apart the great aristocratic households of France, the skilled chefs who had cooked for those noble families suddenly had no employers, and many of them fled, some of them all the way to America. They brought with them something the colonies had never had, the idea of a place you went purely to eat, where you chose your dish from a menu at your own small table, at your own hour, cooked to order by a professional. That idea was the restaurant, and it was completely different from the tavern's shared table and fixed communal meal. In 1794, New York opened the City Hotel with cloth napkins and a gong to call guests to dinner. The all-in-one tavern, with its one pot and its one price and its shared bed upstairs, began to die the moment Americans could afford something finer. Number 4. Boston baked beans. Of everything on this list, this is the dish that refused to die, and it was born from religion as much as from hunger. The Puritan Sabbath forbade all work from Saturday sundown to Sunday sundown, including cooking. So the New England tavern cook solved the problem with beans. On Saturday, she filled a heavy pot with navy beans, a chunk of salt pork, a great spoonful of molasses, and a little mustard, and she buried it in the coals of the banked hearth to cook, slowly, untended, all night long and through the next day. By the time it was ready, the beans had drunk up the molasses and the pork fat until they turned deep brown, sweet and smoky, thick enough to stand a spoon in, ready to eat through the entire Sabbath without anyone lifting a finger. Served with a slab of that steamed brown bread from number 25, it became the Saturday night supper of New England for 200 years, and it is the reason Boston is still called Beantown. Number 3, Indian pudding. When the English colonists wanted the sweet-boiled puddings of home but had no wheat, they turned once again to corn, and the result was Indian pudding, one of the great comfort foods of colonial America. The cook slowly stirred cornmeal into scalded milk until it thickened, then sweetened it with a heavy pour of molasses and warmed it with cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. Then, crucially, she baked it low and slow for hours, sometimes the better part of a day, until it set into a dark, dense, spiced pudding, and the whole tavern filled with the smell of molasses and warm spice. It came out somewhere between a custard and a cake, served hot with a pour of cream melting into the top. On a bitter New England night, a bowl of it was the closest thing to being wrapped in a blanket, and it was the sweet ending that a plain tavern could actually afford to give. Number 2, flip. This was the showstopper, the drink so central to tavern life that it deserves to be near the top of any list of what colonists actually consumed. To make a flip, the tavern keeper combined strong dark beer, a good measure of rum, and a sweetener of molasses or sugar in a heavy pewter tankard, sometimes beating in an egg or a splash of cream to make it rich. Then came the part that made it a spectacle. He kept a long iron rod called a loggerhead sitting directly in the coals of the fire until it glowed red hot, and when the drink was mixed, he pulled it out and plunged it hissing into the tankard. The liquid roared and foamed up in an instant, and the searing iron scorched the sugars into a deep, toasty, caramelized flavor no stovetop could match. He poured the frothing brew back and forth between 2 mugs until it was smooth and creamy, dusted it with nutmeg, and handed it over steaming. Flip was so beloved that one Massachusetts tavern charged more for a mug of it than for a night's sleep. Number 1, hasty pudding. At the top of this list is the plainest thing imaginable, a food so humble and so universal that it became woven into the very song Americans sang about themselves. Hasty pudding was nothing but cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water or milk until it thickened into a smooth, warm porridge, seasoned with a little salt and, if the tavern had it, sweetened with molasses or maple or butter. That was all. It was the first thing a traveler might eat at breakfast, and the last thing served as a quiet supper before the fire burned down, mush and molasses in a wooden bowl. It cost almost nothing. It took minutes, and it filled a stomach when nothing grander was to be had. And when a British officer wanted to mock the ragged colonial soldiers, he sang about a bumpkin named Yankee Doodle. The Americans took the tune and made it their own, and one verse still names this very dish, father and son going down to camp, hasty pudding on the fire. This was the food of a people too busy building a country to fuss over supper. Plain, warm, corn-fed, and stubbornly, permanently American. Here is your challenge. Make one of these this week, just one. The hasty pudding, the baked beans, the Johnny cakes. Then sit down and eat it slow, and imagine the fire, the wet boots by the door, the stranger across the table arguing about a king 3,000 miles away. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the flip gets more love than the syllabub, and whether anyone's family still bakes brown bread on a Saturday. Because these were never just meals. They were the table a whole nation was born around.